Welcome to CS288W, Network Administration. This is Module 5. We will be discussing Chapter 6, Managing and Administering DNS in Windows Server 2008. Our objectives will be to describe and install Active Directory domain services, manage your DNS environment, and troubleshoot your DNS environment. So Active Directory AD clients use DNS to locate all the resources available on the network. DNS servers you can run in ADDS environments are standard DNS servers and ADDS integrated DNS servers, which I will show you in a little bit. Active Directory Domain Services, Microsoft's implementation of a directory services infrastructure. Stores attributes or specific information for objects within a network. So this is some of the types of things that are in a DNS server, some of the information that you can find in there. Domain controllers store the Active Directory objects and information and then replicate that information between different domain controllers. And you would make a Windows 2008 server a domain controller by typing DC promo from a command prompt. DNS requirements for Active Directory. Well, every Active Directory domain in a Windows Server 2008 environment has a naming convention based on a DNS domain name. When a domain controller is added to a domain, SRV and A records are created to allow clients to find a domain controller during logon. If it cannot find those SRV and A records, then they will say, we cannot log in because we cannot find the domain controller. Failure to point your client to internal DNS servers can cause problems. So when you set up your network DHCP server, you want to make sure that the DNS server points to the inside DNS servers, not ones that are out on the internet. So let's look at a DNS Zone Editions in this particular table. You'll see if you go into your DNS zone, every one of your Active Directory DNS servers is going to have one of these underscore MSDCS zone names. This is a Microsoft specific subdomain. Specifies that the domain controllers have Windows Server 2008 specific roles in the domain. So if this zone does not get auto-created, and sometimes that does happen, or it gets accidentally deleted, then you have to recreate it. Domain DNS zone partition. The DNS zone partition stores the domain information that is shared by all domain controllers. There's also DC subdomains, global catalog subdomains, primary domain controller subdomains. These all are different domains that are inside your DNS manager. LDAP serve records. These show which server is a domain controller and responds on the LDAP port. LDAP basically allows you to query users and passwords to gain access to various different pieces of information. So all domain controllers by default are LDAP servers. Same thing with Kerberos servers as well. Used to determine Kerberos Key Distribution Center, or KDCs, the security account database in Active Directory. So it gives information on security, and then password SRV records as well. These records used by clients to determine where the password change service is located, so you can make changes. Benefits of Active Directory DNS: faster and more efficient replication, database security, multi-master support for updates. So these are benefits over the non-Active Directory implementation, which took place in Windows NT 4 and Windows NT 3.5. So since Windows 2000, we've had Active Directory DNS, and it works very well. But there are problems that can occur that will make everything run slowly or make it not run at all. And we'll talk about troubleshooting in a little bit. Active Directory DS site structure. ADDS sites are designed to limit the replication traffic across wide area network links. So if you have a domain controller in two different offices, you can set up special replication limits so you don't end up sending too much information down. In 2003, it would send the information down as one giant file, which would tend to choke the network. In 2008, they improved it by sending incremental changes instead. And that really helped in limiting the amount of replication traffic that happens. You can also change your WAN links manually to go to specific servers and even use a lighter weight protocol such as SMTP. You can create zones for different sites. Each zone has with its own local domain controller to answer local requests, and I'll show you how to create a zone here shortly. Only required ADDS information is passed over the WAN, so information that's not required does not get passed, which limits traffic as well. An example would be bentech.net and eu.bentech.net would be information that would be sent. Dynamic DNS allows supported DNS clients to dynamically update their DNS records on a DNS server. Allows DNS clients to update their A and IP version 6 AAAA and PTR records, which are reverse records we talked about in previous modules. Dynamic DNS deletes records of clients removed from the domain or whose DHCP leases expire. Dynamic DNS also does scavenging process within a DNS database that uses timestamps to determine when records can update themselves and when to remove old records. So just like any other scavenger, it goes in and takes out the stuff you don't need anymore. So you can do various types of things from your command prompt that show DNS information, and one of them we talked about before was ipconfig. But if you want to register, sort of a force register, your computer so the record shows up in DNS, you can do an ipconfig/register DNS. Now the DNS server by default will go out and find your computer name, but in some cases when you make a change, you'll want to register the DNS so it happens right away. So if you change your computer from PC1 to PC2 and you have resources on your computer that other people need to gain access to, such as a printer, then you'll want to do the register DNS so it forces it to happen right away rather than waiting for it to happen in the usual replication time period. DHCP configuration. By default, DHCP is configured to provide dynamic updates to clients that support this feature. The DNS configuration uses dynamic updates to be configured at the DNS zone level. There are two different types of secure updates. You can do secure updates performed only by an authenticated client or one that's a member of a domain, or a non-secure update performed by any client, such as a Linux or Unix computer that's not a member of a domain but does want to be able to update itself to the DNS server. So secure would be what I just did from a computer that is a member of a domain. And like I said earlier, a Linux or Unix, which would be a non-secure, you can make it so these don't automatically update or that they do. By default, they will not update non-secure updates. DNS Console, that's your main GUI tool used for configuring DNS. I showed you in the last module. Provides access to all DNS zones available on a server along with configuration settings for the DNS role. So from the DNS Console, you can go in and make all kinds of changes. You can also do it through command line. Actually, the DNS Manager allows you to add DNS servers as well. So instead of just managing just the one server from the console, you can now manage multiple servers from the console. Configuration settings in the DNS console, DNS server level, configuration and maintenance tasks you can perform, configuring a DNS server, creating a zone, set aging and scavenging, and scavenge stale records. So you can do all that from the console yourself. The DNS zone level, that's the level where all DNS zones exist. Forward and reverse zones are there as well. And the DNS record level, you can modify and delete records, defining security settings on the DNS record, and manage scavenging settings, and set time to live. Setting the time to live, you can make it either longer or shorter based on whether or not you want it to update more often or less often. Round robin DNS allows an administrator to configure load balancing of servers. I showed you that in the last module, where you can go in and check the box for round robin, which it is by default, or uncheck it in case you don't want to do any of that load balancing. Conditional forwarding, forwarding based on a specific domain name. Quote, if request for a specific domain, forward the lookup to this IP. So if someone is looking for yahoo.com, you can say forward it to this particular IP address and it will do the resolution. So that's conditional forwarding based on a specific domain name. Conditional forwards folder under your server, so you can set it up in your DNS console. Troubleshooting DNS. There's all different kinds of ways to troubleshoot DNS. And as I mentioned earlier, DNS slow. Anytime you see a slowness in your network or your computer, 95% of the time, it's probably going to be DNS. And so that's the first place I always look anytime somebody says something's running slowly. The DNS server logs, you have the global logs folder, contains a subset of the event logs relating specifically to DNS called DNS events. Let's take a look at that. So if we go into our event viewer, we can expand the application logs, application services, and you can see DNS servers. From here, you can see events. These information ones are not bad. They're just informational only. But if you see any yellow or red ones, oh, there's some red ones right there, we can see that there was a problem with the DNS server. And we can also see warnings in case something is going on that's negative, but not necessarily bad enough to bring the server down. Critical errors, which we don't see any here, mean that there is something critical with the service. It won't start, it won't function, that kind of thing. Errors are second worst, and then followed by warnings, and then informational is not bad at all. So this is where you'll find your DNS server logs. Make sure you keep that in mind in case you get asked that at another time. So let's take a look at creating a zone. So we have a forward lookup zones right here. If we right click and we choose new zone, we get some interesting options, and you'll be doing this in your lab. One of the options that we get is primary, secondary, or stub. We talked about the last module, why would you want to use a secondary over a stub or vice versa. A primary is always used when you want to store it in Active Directory. So if this is going to be an Active Directory zone that gets replicated to other Active Directory zones, then you'll want to make sure it's a primary and that this box is checked saying to store it in Active Directory. So we'll go ahead and uncheck that this particular time, and then we'll choose a zone name, and we'll call it test.local. And you can see that it automatically creates the .dns zone file for us, which is fine. And we're going to go ahead and say do not allow dynamic updates. If we did allow dynamic updates, then we could choose whether they were secure or not. And finish. Okay, so now we've got our test.local. And if we click on that, you can see it already created a start of authority to say who's authoritative for this, and it's the name of this particular server. It also gave us the name of the name server, which happens to be the same server. It doesn't necessarily have to be. I could have the name server different than the start of authority. In this case, it is the same. So I can double click on one of those records and it brings us right to the properties of this particular zone. And we can go in and make various different changes, which I showed you to do in the last one. Now if we right click on here, we can choose to create a new host record. So I'll create a host record and we'll call it server 1. And then we'll give it the IP address. All right, we can also set a time to live on here as well. So we can say hours, minutes, seconds, things like that before it gets refreshed. And if we leave this box checked, it will also create a reverse record. I'm going to uncheck that right now as we don't need it, but I'll go ahead and click that and it says, oh, it was created, which is great. So here is our host record. Now if I go to our command prompt and I type ping server1.test.local, then it says, oh, hey, that's 192.168.50. So it picked it up right away, which is exactly what we wanted. Now, of course, there is no .50 here, so we're going to timeout. But the good thing is that our DNS server worked like it was supposed to. I put in the fully qualified domain name, and it found the IP address. Now, if I put that information in and it didn't show up right away, then I can force it to show up by typing ipconfig/flush DNS. So this will clear out any old records and make sure it refreshes any new records, and then I should be able to do the name resolution at that point. So that's a real common issue when you go to create new records, especially when you create the new records on one server and you're trying to access those records from another, such as from a client. So from the client computer, I can do the same thing. I can do an ipconfig /flush DNS, and then that will get those records to show up right away. So on the DNS event logs, the default size is set to 16 megs. You have a filter tab that allows you to filter, modify the view of the DNS server so you can see just the error logs, or just the warning logs, or just the critical logs. So you can filter that information so you can see just what you're looking for right away. There are several different command line utilities that I've already showed you, such as ping, and you can ping a server by name, or you can ping -A to do the reverse lookup by IP address. So ping -A and an IP address will do the reverse lookup. ipconfig, I showed you the flush DNS. I showed you the display DNS I didn't show you, but you can do that as well. And register DNS we talked about earlier, registers whatever client computer, so the name will show up in the DNS server right away rather than waiting for the standard replication time to happen. DC diag allows you to perform diagnostic queries on your DCs. If you run DC diag on any domain controller, then you will get a huge list of pass or fail tests that are run on your server. And if you see any that fail, you can look up the error code on the internet, and then it will tell you why it is that it failed, and then you'll be able to troubleshoot it. NSLOOKUP allows you to do detailed information lookups from a command line. So if I typed NSLOOKUP right here, I may get there we go. It's showing the Google server I'm using to do my lookups. You can also do NSLOOKUPs directly from your server. So since it's domain controller, it says, hey, NSLOOKUP, hey, I'm looking for the name server. Well, I'm your name server right here. But if you wanted to, you could do an NSLOOKUP and then type in the name of the server. So type in NSLOOKUP Exchange Host 3, and it says, oh, Exchange Host 3. Here's the fully qualified domain name, and here's the IP address. So NSLOOKUPs are great. It's a great tool to help you troubleshoot issues. You can do a non-interactive or an interactive. The non-interactive allows you to perform a single query from the command line by entering all the query parameters. The interactive one allows you to launch NSLOOKUP in a command line shell where you can define the parameters one by one, such as we just did. So here's some information you can get when you run a debug, and it's when you're having issues, you can look at the log files for your DNS server, and it will tell you all kinds of information that it might find that a Microsoft engineer, if you're looking for help, can also help you define what that is, and the book does a pretty good job on explaining all this type of information as well. Some of it's pretty self-explanatory. Others you might need to look up a little bit on what all these different things mean. So in summary, we talked about an ADDS environment. You can run two different types of DNS servers, standard and DNS integrated. And basically, you just check that little box to make it a DNS integrated server like I showed you when you create a primary zone. ADDS uses domain controllers to store all the Active Directory objects and information about an environment. It uses a database structure to maintain its objects. Active Directory requires DNS for locating domain controllers or the DS locator function. And I talked about dynamic DNS and what you can do with allowing supported DNS clients to dynamically update their own records. And I showed you a little bit more of the DNS Console, the GUI. So let's take a look real quick at our lab for this particular week. DNS in Active Directory. So make sure you note that steps 6 through 8, there's an unmentioned requirement to prioritize the interface. But go ahead and read that and take a look. There's a link to an article, that kind of thing. You're going to be doing the netsh command a lot, and after doing the netsh, you're going to be getting some captures along with some ipconfig/all, which I showed you earlier. So make sure that you take a look at that. This is a pretty straightforward lab. It's not really complicated as long as you follow the directions. Shouldn't be too confusing. Just go ahead and type the commands as required and do the usual submission. So that's it for Module 5.